This is an extract from the Leader Coronavirus Daily podcast by the Evening Standard and hosted by me, David Marsland. To hear the whole thing, search for it on your podcast provider. According to Policing Minister Kit Malthouse, you should absolutely call the police if you see your neighbours having more than 6 people round the house. That's after the rule of 6 came into force last night, despite claims it will keep families apart and ruin Christmas. And if you do get dobbed in by next door, you could be fined £100 with penalties doubling for further offences up to £3,200. Our editorial column worries things have gone too far.
From solidarity to spying, nothing sums up the crushing of hope and goodwill more than this set of incomprehensible rules. The proud and moving community spirit which carried our country through the start of this nightmare is being killed by a government which no longer trusts the people to do the right thing. It has swapped hope for a snooper's charter. Remember why the spring lockdown worked. Not because it was enforced by a sinister new breed of COVID marshals patrolling the streets, or by neighbours shopping each other to the police, but because people understood the rules, why they were needed, and most cooperated. Very few people were fined. We need to get back to the spirit of spring. That means helping our neighbours, not spying on them.
Our Courts correspondent Tristan Kirk's here. Tristan, let's start with what's actually in these new laws. And they came in very last minute last night, didn't they?
Yes, the new legislation for the rule of 6, as it's being called, actually got published about 25-30 minutes before the law was due to come into effect. So although there was an announcement made earlier on, a few days earlier, and the rule of 6 has been heavily trailed over the course of the week, the actual laws that back it up and what people might have to look at if they were accused of breaking it were only published very close to midnight.
And there are some exemptions, aren't there? What kind of things can people do under this new rule of 6?
Well, so the headline is that gatherings on social occasions are limited to 6 people, but there are a whole host of exemptions that people can be in more numbers. So an obvious example would be a large-scale protest where there's obviously going to be more than 6 people in a certain area at the same time. Other examples are weddings, funerals, and workplaces, schools, colleges. So there's a whole world of exemptions from the rule of 6, which tends to apply to anything that could be loosely described as a social occasion or gathering.
One thing you can't do is mingle, Tristan. Is there a legal definition for the word mingle?
There isn't a legal definition for the word mingle. It is a brand new legal term as far as anyone can tell, and somewhat unfortunately it's been included in this new law that everyone is grappling with, but with no proper explanation as to what it means. So in the normal course of events, people know what mingling is, but could it possibly be applied to saying hello to somebody or holding the door open for them? These may seem like trivial points in the grand scheme of things, but actually it's rather important to people if they're trying to approach these social gatherings within the spirit of the rules that have been set down. They need to understand exactly what the rules say.
That's the kind of thing that lawyers love to discuss, isn't it, Tristan?
Well, obviously the lawyers have been analysing these new rules quite closely, and the rules that have come before them, because when push comes to shove and people are accused of breaking the rules, then that's going to be critical that the laws have been drafted in terms that people can actually understand, because if they're so widely drafted or loosely termed that people can't understand what they actually apply to, then the chances are that when it comes to a court of law, for example, or the police enforcing the law on the streets, that they won't be able to do their jobs properly.
What have the police said about enforcing the law on the streets? Because you're our court correspondent, Tristan. Are we expecting lots of people to be ending up in court over this?
Well, frankly, we're not expecting people to end up in court over this. I was watching closely as the lockdown came in late March, and there was a rash of prosecutions of people who were accused of breaking the lockdown in late March and early April and through until mid-May. And that was when everyone was told basically stay at home unless you've got a really pressing reason to go outside again. But since mid-May, essentially, in London, they've stopped bringing court cases for people who've been accused of breaking the lockdown rules in some way or the other, and that's because the lockdown rules became, in my view, very, very complicated, and enforcing them in a court setting would have been even more complicated and perhaps wouldn't be seen as worth it. But the police began very quickly to adopt an alternative approach to these rules, where instead of slapping people with fines and then perhaps taking them to court, they would try to educate people, encourage them to follow the rules, and do anything else but enforce the rules that they could possibly do. Because, frankly, there would be a lot of time and energy taken up in the police forces and the courts in trying to enforce these rules by the legal proceedings, and they perhaps took a view that it wasn't worth their time and energy to do that, so there were better ways of going about it.
Search for the Leader Coronavirus Daily on any podcast provider to hear more from the podcast.